After studying this module, you will be able to understand how income and interest rate are determined in the ISLM framework, know the meaning of fiscal policy, understand the impact of fiscal policy using the ISLM framework, comprehend the crowding out effects of fiscal policy, learn about deficit financing, know the meaning of monetary policy. The previous two modules introduced the concepts of the IS and LM curves. The present module is essentially an extension of the two previous modules. It brings together the IS and LM curves to see how equilibrium interest and income are determined simultaneously when both goods and money markets are in equilibrium. Such a synthesis will be useful in understanding the impact of fiscal and monetary policies on interest and income. Now we study how these markets are brought into simultaneous equilibrium. It is only when the equilibrium pairs of interest rate and income of the IS curve equal the equilibrium pairs of interest rate and income of the LM curve that the general equilibrium is established. In other words, when there is a single pair of interest rate and income level in the product and money markets, that the two markets are in equilibrium. Determination of equilibrium interest rate and income. The downward sloping IS curve and the upward sloping LM curve are brought together to determine the equilibrium in goods and asset market. You may recall that the IS curve depicts all interest rate and income combinations for which the goods market is in equilibrium, that is, where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. The LM curve depicts all such points for which the assets market, that is, bond market, is in equilibrium and where demand for money is equal to supply of money. The point of intersection of IS and LM, point E, represents equilibrium in the goods as well as money and bond markets. We can see this in the figure. Y star I star represents the equilibrium output and interest rate at which goods and money markets are simultaneously in equilibrium. All other points that are off the IS and LM curve reflect disequilibrium in both markets. You may recall in the previous modules, we characterized the nature of disequilibrium for points lying to the right and left of the IS and LM curves. We will now see in case there is disequilibrium and the economy is either in region 1, 2, 3 or 4, there will be adjustments that would induce movement towards the equilibrium point E. Let us now see how adjustment takes place in the money market starting from a disequilibrium situation. To understand the adjustment process, let us see the points above the LM curve. You may recall at all points above or to the left of the LM curve, interest rates are higher than required for equilibrium in money market. So there would be excess supply of money ESM at such points. Excess supply of money means there is excess demand for bonds, driving up bond price and hence lowering interest rates. Due to this, there would be pressure on interest rates to go down till they reach a point on the LM curve where once again the money market is in equilibrium. This is demonstrated by a downward pointing arrow at such points that lie in quadrants 1 and 4 in figure. Similarly, at all points that lie below the LM curve, the interest rates are lower than what is required for money market equilibrium. At such a low interest rate, demand for money would be much higher than its supply, resulting in excess demand for money (EDM). This results in excess supply of bonds that induces a fall in bond prices and creates pressures on interest rates to rise till it reaches a point on the LM curve and money market equilibrium is restored. This is reflected by the upward pointing arrows in quadrants 2 and 3. Let us now see how adjustment takes place in the goods market starting from a disequilibrium situation. Once again, recall from our discussion in previous modules that at all points to the right of the IS curve, output exceeds aggregate demand and there is excess supply of output ESO. In this case, there would be involuntary accumulation of inventories, inducing firms to cut back production till inventory targets are met. Therefore, due to excess supply of output, there will be a downward pressure on output towards the IS curve, reflected in the arrows pointing leftward in quadrants 1 and 2 in figure. Similarly, at all points to the left of IS curve, output falls short of aggregate demand and there is excess demand for output. In this case, firms' actual inventories fall below planned levels, inducing them to increase production. This results in increase in output and a movement towards the IS curve as reflected by the arrows pointing rightward in quadrants 3 and 4. This explains the kind of adjustments that would be observed starting from points of disequilibrium that are off the IS and LM curve. From the directions indicated by the arrows, it should be clear to you that such adjustments tend to restore equilibrium in the system. For instance, if the economy lies in quadrant 1, there is excess supply of money ESM and excess supply of output ESO. The interest rates will show a tendency to fall and so will output. This will result in movement towards the equilibrium E. We will now go on to discuss factors that shift the IS and LM curves. In the following sections, we will then discuss how such shifts bring about changes in equilibrium output and interest rates. Fiscal policy. In this section, we will examine the impact of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy refers to policies related to changes in government expenditure G and or revenues, that is taxes T. Let us first consider the impact of fiscal expansion caused by an increase in G. It was seen in the previous module that a fiscal expansion causes a rightward shift in the IS curve. Thus, an increase in G will shift the IS curve to the right from IS1 to IS2 as shown in the figure. The new equilibrium is reached at point E2 where the interest rates and income are higher than at original equilibrium E1. So, expansionary fiscal policy raises income and boosts employment, but the interest rate rises as there is an increase in the transactions demand for money with the increase in income of households. While money supply is unchanged, the LM curve does not shift. This increase in the interest rate reduces private investment as investment demand is negatively related to the rate of interest. In the figure, note if the interest rate had remained unchanged at I1 after the shift in IS from IS1 to IS2, then income would have expanded to its maximum possible level Y max. The rise in interest rate from I1 to I2 choked off investment by the amount Y2 Y max. This dampening of private investment due to expansionary fiscal policy is known as the crowding out effect. Another way of conducting expansionary fiscal policy could be by reducing the tax rate. This would also shift the IS curve to the right, similar to the shift demonstrated in figure. In this case too, income would rise from Y1 to Y2 and so would the interest rate from I1 to I2, resulting in crowding out. Just as crowding out takes place, it has been argued that crowding in is also possible. For instance, in developing economies, public expenditure may bring about improvement in infrastructure and thereby foster private investment despite higher interest rates. Owing to the presence of complementarity between public and private investment. In such cases, private investment may be crowded in. Contrary to fiscal expansion, an attempt to reduce budget deficits or fiscal consolidation policies leads to a decline in output and interest rate in the short run. Due to rising budget deficits, governments in many developing countries find it difficult to manage the size of public debt. The problem can be quite profound, especially if the budget deficit is driven largely by unproductive expenditure rather than productive investment. In this case, rising interest cost of debt could make public debt unmanageable. Generally, a low debt to GDP ratio indicates that public debt is sustainable. However, if debt GDP ratio is extremely high, governments may choose to finance expenditure by borrowing from the central bank. In this case, the assets and correspondingly the liabilities of the central bank or high-powered money increase. So, this option amounts to financing public expenditure by printing money. This is also referred to as deficit financing or monetization of government debt. However, the creation of money without backing by adequate productive resources may add to inflationary pressures in the economy, especially in the medium term.
When the government changes the supply of money in the economy or administers and influences interest rates. If it were to raise money supply, there would be more available in the economy for spending, interest rates would fall and aggregate demand would rise. Keynes argued that this was a less reliable policy than fiscal policy, since some of the extra money could be used for speculation in bond market rather than spending on real goods and services. There are many tools of the monetary policy that are used by government. Some of them are reserve requirements, bank rate, open market operations, and repurchase transactions. Reserve requirements. Reserve Bank of India (RBI) sets a certain minimum reserve ratio whereby it specifies the percentage share of deposits that commercial banks are required to maintain as reserves. In India, this is called the cash reserve ratio or CRR. Bank rate. At times, commercial banks borrow money from the central bank. The rate charged by the central bank for such loans is called bank rate. Third tool of monetary policy used by RBI is open market operations. The purchase and sale of government securities and bonds is referred to as open market operations of the central bank. In case of repurchase transactions, the central bank purchases securities from commercial banks with the intention of selling back to them at a specified date, usually less than a month, and price. This is a form of short-term lending by the central bank to commercial banks against the collateral of government securities. The lending rate of the central bank or rate at which central bank is buying securities in this case is referred to as the repo rate. Reverse repo rate, on the other hand, refers to the rate at which commercial banks make short-term loans to the central bank against government securities under a repurchase agreement. That is, in this case, the central bank sells securities to commercial banks with the intention of buying them back at a specified date, again usually less than a month and price. Then we will move on to see how the conduct of monetary policy affects macroeconomic equilibrium in the ISLM framework, followed by the effectiveness of the monetary and fiscal policy. We will notice that monetary policy is ineffective when the IS curve is vertical. The fiscal policy is ineffective when the LM curve is vertical. In this case, complete crowding out takes place. Fiscal policy is extremely effective while monetary policy becomes ineffective when the economy is in a liquidity trap. Liquidity trap is a situation characterized by very low rates of interest when the demand for money becomes infinitely elastic and the LM curve becomes horizontal.
Monetary policy refers to the actions of the central bank as it attempts to change money supply and influence the rate of interest. There are several tools used by a central bank in conducting monetary policy. These are reserve requirements, bank rate, open market operations, and repurchase transactions. Let us study each one in detail. Reserve requirements. The central bank can conduct monetary policy through a change in reserve requirements. Reserve Bank of India (RBI) sets a certain minimum reserve ratio whereby it specifies the percentage share of deposits that commercial banks are required to maintain as reserves. In India, this is called the cash reserve ratio or CRR. If the central bank increases the reserve ratio, this reduces available funds at the disposal of commercial banks for lending out to borrowers. This reduces money supply. Remember, money supply is cash plus bank deposits in the economy. On the contrary, if the central bank wants to expand money supply, it would reduce the CRR. Bank rate. At times, commercial banks borrow money from the central bank. The rate charged by the central bank for such loans is called bank rate. A change in bank rate affects the interest rate structure and results in changes in all other interest rates in the economy. For instance, an increase in bank rate signals a tight money policy that is likely to lead to higher interest rates charged by commercial banks on loans made by them as banks' own lending costs increase. Third tool of monetary policy used by RBI is open market operations. The purchase and sale of government securities and bonds is referred to as open market operations of the central bank. Purchase of securities by the central bank increases the supply of money in the economy. This is referred to as cheap or easy money policy, which involves an increase in the central bank's stock of bonds and a corresponding increase in cash and bank deposits with the public. On the other hand, a sale of government securities by central bank reduces the supply of money in the economy. This is referred to as tight money policy. Repurchase transactions. In case of repurchase transactions, the central bank purchases securities from commercial banks with the intention of selling back to them at a specified date and price. This is a form of short term lending by the central bank to commercial banks against the collateral of government securities. The lending rate of the central bank, or the rate at which central bank is buying securities, in this case is referred to as the repo rate. It is known as the policy rate of the central bank, as monetary easing or tightening are usually signaled by a lowering or a raising of the repo rate. Reverse repo rate, on the other hand, refers to the rate at which commercial banks make short term loans to the central bank against government securities under a repurchase agreement. That is, in this case, the central bank sells securities to commercial banks with the intention of buying them back at a specified date. Again, usually less than a month and price. Usually, the repo rate serves as the basis when commercial banks set their lending rates. A repo transaction is undertaken to increase liquidity, while a reverse repo policy is used to reduce liquidity in the economy. These monetary instruments have become important short term tools for managing liquidity in the Indian economy. We will now see how the conduct of monetary policy affects macroeconomic equilibrium in the ISLM framework. Consider an increase in the supply of money from M1 divided by P to M2 divided by P. In this case, the LM curve shifts rightwards from LM1 to LM2 and the equilibrium interest rate falls from I1 to I2 while income increases from Y1 to Y2. Let us understand how this happens. As the money supply expands, with demand for money remaining unchanged, there is excess supply for money, hence excess demand for bonds, due to which interest rates fall. As a result, investment expands and income increases to Y2. This increase in income further raises consumption expenditures via the multiplier effect. The new equilibrium is attained after the decline in interest rate and increase in income increases money demand until it is equal to the increase in money supply. This happens at the point E2 where IS curve intersects the new LM curve LM2. Let us now move over to look at the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy. We will now discuss some of the factors that determine the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy in bringing about changes in income and output. The above discussion shows, in general, both monetary and fiscal policies can affect the level of income. However, monetary policy is rendered ineffective in certain cases. Example, when the IS curve is vertical, as we can see in the figure. The IS curve becomes vertical when investment is totally insensitive to changes in interest rate. When IS curve is vertical, an expansion in money supply shifts LM from LM1 to LM2. However, there is no change in income. Hence, monetary policy becomes totally ineffective in affecting income. No doubt, this is an extreme case, but the point you should note is if aggregate demand is not very sensitive to changes in the rate of interest, the IS curve would be very steep. In this case, very large interest rate changes are required to bring about even a small change in output. Thus, we may conclude that the steeper the IS curve, lower is the effectiveness of monetary policy. Fiscal policy becomes ineffective when the LM curve is vertical, as we can see in the figure. The LM curve is vertical when money demand is insensitive to changes in interest rate. This is the view held by monetarists who emphasize the importance of transactions demand for money. They also argue that money affects output levels directly and not via the rate of interest. With a vertical LM curve, A fiscal expansion that shifts IS curve from IS1 to IS2 has no impact on output. Only the interest rate increases in this case, and at the new equilibrium, complete crowding out takes place. That is, the reduction in private investment due to the rising interest rate is equal to the initial increase in government investment, so that output remains unchanged. In this case, expansionary monetary policy would shift the LM curve and lead to an increase in output, illustrating the monetarist's point about the direct impact of money on output. We will now discuss the case of the concept of liquidity trap, a situation characterized by very low rates of interest. When the demand for money becomes infinitely elastic and the LM curve becomes horizontal, as can be seen in figure. When interest rates are very low, correspondingly, bond prices are very high, and everyone expects bond prices to fall. As such, to avoid capital loss due to expected fall in bond price, everyone wishes to move out of bonds and hold money. Once the economy is in a liquidity trap, an increase in money supply fails to lower interest rates any further, since people willingly hold any extra money that is pumped into the system. In this case, monetary policy is ineffective as it has no impact on output. However, fiscal policy is extremely effective in this case. Expansionary fiscal policy that shifts the IS curve from IS1 to IS2 and raises output from Y1 to Y2, and there is no crowding out as the interest rate does not increase since people do not make portfolio changes. Recently advanced economies like Japan and USA have experienced a liquidity trap situation with interest rates touching zero. In fact, European economies like Denmark and Switzerland even had negative interest rates. We will have more to say on these in later modules once we explore the relation between interest rates and exchange rates. Moving on to monetary and fiscal policy mix. Sometimes monetary and fiscal policy may be used simultaneously to attain certain policy objectives. Suppose government expenditure G is increased, shifting the IS curve to right from IS1 to IS2. Due to this increase in G, interest rate would increase, resulting in crowding out, with income increasing only till Y2 and not up to Y3. However, if this fiscal measure is accompanied by expansionary monetary policy, crowding out could be averted. In this case, increase in money supply shifts the LM curve rightward from LM1 to LM2, and the new equilibrium is E3, where LM2 and IS2 intersect each other. The crowding out that takes place as a result of fiscal action is prevented due to an appropriate expansionary monetary policy. Let us consider another case where fiscal and monetary policies are used in conjunction by the government. An increase in taxation reduces disposable income and shifts the IS curve leftward from IS1 to IS2. This reduces interest rates, but the resultant rise in private investment may not compensate for the fall in demand caused by the fall in disposable incomes. So, income might be reduced from Y1 to Y2. In order to prevent this fall in income, the monetary authorities could increase money supply till the LM1 shifts to its new position LM2. The accommodating monetary expansion reduces interest rate and stimulates investment demand further, thereby increasing income to the previous level of Y1 despite higher taxes at the new equilibrium at E3. The two cases that we discussed illustrate how a mix of monetary and fiscal policies may be used to attain certain objectives.
Let us now summarize what we studied in this module. In this module, we learned the point of intersection of IS and LM represents equilibrium in the goods as well as money and hence bonds markets. Points that are off the IS and LM curve reflect disequilibrium in both markets that cause adjustments that restore equilibrium. At all points above the LM curve, there would be an excess supply of money. Due to this, there would be pressure on interest rates to go down. At all points to the right and above the IS curve, there will be excess supply of output. Due to this, there will be downward pressure on output. The dampening of private investment due to increased interest rates caused by expansionary fiscal policy is known as crowding out effect. When the debt relative to GDP is at extremely high levels, governments might have to finance expenditures by borrowing from the central bank or printing money. This is referred to as deficit financing or monetization of government debt. The reserve requirement, bank rate, open market operations, and repurchase transactions that include repo and Reverse repo rates are important instruments of monetary policy in India. Monetary policy is ineffective when the IS curve is vertical. The fiscal policy is ineffective when the LM curve is vertical. In this case, complete crowding out takes place. Fiscal policy is extremely effective while monetary policy becomes ineffective when the economy is in a liquidity trap. Governments may use a mix of monetary and fiscal policies, especially to prevent any crowding out of private investment that might occur as a result of fiscal action.